Good morning,
Thank
everyone.
you. Second.
Here we go. Hello,
Mhm.
everyone. I'm Carmen DeBona, and welcome to Il-MALTIN TAGNA, presented by the Maltese Center of New York, featuring conversations with people who do extraordinary things, each sharing his or her experience and accomplishments. Our guest today is retired teacher and author Alfred Conti Borda. Alfred is the author of Malta's Unsung Heroes, Volume 1 and Volume 2. He was born in 1943 and currently lives in Malta. Alfred's interest in World War II started at a young age with his dad, having served in the Royal Navy and later in the Royal Air Force. Alfred's interest in World War II started at a young age with his dad, having served in the Royal Navy. His interest in the history and events of World War II led him to research wartime heroes of Maltese and British personnel, including civilians. He met many of them and turned them into interviews into short biographies. These were then published in the Sunday Times of Malta over the years. Alfred managed to write a total of 23 stories. This talk will be about this book he wrote, Malta's Unsung Heroes. Good morning, everyone. Welcome.
Mm. Good morning.
How are
Yeah.
you?
All right. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes. All right. At least you can hear me.
That's okay. So tell me, how did this project start?
Well, actually, I was always interested in the history of the Second World War. I always had in my mind to sort of to write a story when I was in the yes. So there I am.
Welcome, yay.
Welcome.
And our audience, just be patient. You know, we're dealing with technology and internet and all these things. And we always pray that everything works seamlessly. So great to see you, Alfred.
Thank you very much. Same there. Nice to see you again.
Yes.
And well, I wasn't interested in becoming an author. When I was in the secondary schools, I used to watch. I always watched war films, and I still watch them till now. And I used to write a short brief up of the film which I saw. It would have been either a true event, or it could be, fictitious event. But anyway, I used to write these small stories in a page of a copybook and then give it to my superiors. At that time, I was with the Jesuits. I started the Jesuit St. Aloysius College in 1955, when Dad was still in the Royal Navy. And well, I wrote them and gave them to them for correction. And they used to tell me, look, this is the right verb to use here and to not use here and there. And they encouraged me. They encouraged me. There were two Jesuit fathers. One was a professor of theology, Father Eminian, and I wrote his story. And one was Father Joseph Bernard, who was uh, the director of studies, very strict, but they were both both old of the same age, and they studied not together. They studied at different times during Second World War. Father Arminian started his studies in Bulgaria and Italy, in Sicily, and then continued to the north of Italy. And it was a struggle, not to survive only, but to survive and learn and how to become a priest. How to administer the holy sacraments. Usually, the Jesuits take 10 years to take the holy orders. The father, spent all the warriors in Italy. Father Naudi, on the other hand, who used to teach me geometry, because at the time the mathematics was divided into three subjects: geometry, algebra, and rhythm. He used to teach me geometry and physics, and I liked him very much. Very nice chap, an ideal photographer, And I wrote his story too. But he didn't remain in Bulgaria and Sicily during the war. He returned because of the start of the war. He was afraid that he would caught up as Father Emilio, I didn't know, but as Father Emilio was caught up, and Father Salvino Darmani, rector of the college, very nice gentleman, and another father, Father Joseph Orr. I have written their stories, in occupied Italy. Very interesting. And since my wife was teaching at De La Salle College with the La Sallian brothers. I came to know Brother James, because they are brothers, Christian brothers of De La Salle. Brother James, and I wrote his story. He was in Vichy held North Africa. Vichy was in collaboration with Nazi Germany. And he was in Algeria, I think. Yes, I don't remember now. I've written this story about 10 years ago. And father and brother Edward. Brother Edward is still alive. He's 97 years old. When he went to study in France, they both studied in France, because La Salle was born in there. So Jean-Baptiste de La Salle was born in France. Yes, and they used to study there. So they both orders were in occupied, Jesuits in occupied Italy, German occupied Italy, and the brothers in occupied France. Because when the Germans invaded France, they occupied the north of France. They didn't occupy the south, which is called the Vichy France. But then, with the landings of the Allied troops in North Africa, then they occupied the south of France. That's where, the brothers were in real danger. They were both in danger, because the Germans wanted to collaboration from the brothers, and the brothers, they didn't refuse directly, but they refused indirectly. The Germans told them that if they saw any fishy things, because the French used to live, the Free French, they were against the Germans. They were sabotaging trains, blowing up trains and attacking German troops, and they were lying in wait in bushes or trees, and there was a line, a line going along the college of where the brothers were studying in Pibrac, I remember, Pibrac. There were some bushes there and low trees, and the Germans came and told the brothers to cut off the trees so that the monkey won't hide there. And they gave them a whistle to whistle it whenever they saw something fishy. But the brothers never blew the whistle. All right.
So this father that you're speaking of, he's
brother,
in. Yes, he was one of your teachers, you said?
No, the brothers were not my teachers. The father, the Jesuit fathers were my teachers.
Right. So he was the one that was in your book, in one of your books here.
Yeah, and it's in the book too, this one.
Right. So he was really one of your inspirations that got you to.
Yes, he inspired me, because I interviewed him. Mm-hmm. He's still living. He's 97 years old, and he's old. He's the only one living, and there's another lady. It's the one who rang the bell, and everybody was scurrying for the shelter.
Right. So how did Father end up? His story end up being in your book? What was something about his story that that led you to put it inside this book, and his encounter with World War II and what he experienced? What was like some of these like harrowing experiences that that he directly felt during this time?
They were harrowing experiences, because when the Germans realized that the brothers didn't at any time blow the whistle, so they suspected they were collaborators with the Free French. Mm-hmm. So, and one day, for 3 Nazi soldiers, with an officer, came and asked for the brothers, for the Maltese brothers.
Why do you think they only asked for them?
For them, and Brother Vidal, he saved them, because, sorry, they are not here. You know what? I don't know. It's the war. and he saved the brothers' lives. He came to ask for Brother Norbert from the La Salle, Brother Edward, and Brother Louis. Three of them. They were in the same college. And then that same evening, the brothers packed everything and went to another brothers' college, in another part of the country. So they escaped. But he saved the brothers' lives. He could have told them they're here. His brother Vidal, he's in the second book as well.
Yeah, I find it fascinating because, like, as I look through some of these stories, I never realized how many Maltese were actually out during the war.
Yes.
Not just constricted to the islands and experiencing the war there, but actually in either active duty or, like you said, the Jesuits or the brothers in Europe experiencing the Nazis firsthand, as most Maltese people only experienced the air raids and never really encountered, face to face. And I just found that very fascinating and exciting. And so I wanted you to, kind of explain, how did you, embark on these interviews? Like, you had, excuse me if I mispronounce his name, Father Armenian is the correct pronunciation?
Yes. I interviewed him about 3 times. He wrote a book. I have a book of his experiences. I had to condense it into maybe, I don't know how many pages. It was about 4 or 5 A4 pages. I had to condense it, you see. And I interviewed him about 3 times. And every time I used to surface them. He told, "Do you have a copy of my story in the paper?" And I used to give him one every time. And I have only one left now. He passed away, but at least I have one left. See, and as I have said in my book, he escaped over the Swiss border, because when Mussolini lost the war, he was put into a sort of jail, in the north of Italy, and a very courageous German colonel, Otto Scherzny, was the commander, and he rescued him from there.
So he had to cross to the Swiss border from. So he was.
And then yes, so when Mussolini gave in, he surrendered. Italy was divided in two. The south was in the Allied hands, and the north was in the German hands. So the some of fascists which didn't give in were in the north, and that's where the Jesuits tried to cross the border from Italy into Switzerland. Then they encountered about 4 fascist soldiers, and he told them, "Sorry, we would like to cross the. Why do you want to cross? Because you want to study. What are you studying?
Right.
Told you have any money? Yes, I have money. So they turned out their pockets, emptied their pockets, and they told them, and told, all right."
So money and God was involved in their escape to Switzerland, right?
Yes, even the Jesuits were, Father Rector, Father Salvino Darmani. He was in 5 different prisoner of war camps,
Right.
He protested when he was arrested by them. He told them, "I am a religious man. I don't care. You have a British passport. You are." They sent him 4 different prisoner of war camps.
Yeah, I just find it fascinating because I'm envisioning these people running across the land, and you see these in films, and the way you've written these, I feel like it's so film worthy. I could see these people running and planning their escapes and evading, and it's written with such detail, and I really experience what you just reiterated to our audience. So over the years, how did you win people's trust to speak to you about their stories, and knowing that you would you know, stay true to their experience, because they are true stories. They're kind of some, you know, biographies that you're writing. And so how was that handled? Like, what was the process, you know, the research?
It was easier with the Royal Navy men, because they used to lend me their record of service. And they used to say, I served on that ship and that ship, and then I told them, all right, give me the record of service, please. And then I tallied it with the ships, 15 September 1940, HMS Sussex. Yes, I was there. Where? Here. Oh, yes. So I wrote it down. See, that it was easier with this. With the Air Force men, I interviewed I interviewed the person who came to Aviation Museum here. I guided him, you know, because I'm a volunteer guide there, and he told me, you know, I was on an Ancaster, it's a 4-engine bomb, and he was shot down, and out of 7 people, because the bomber has 7 people now, front gunner, back gunner, navigator, bomber, pilot, and all that. And he was shot down and he was caught prisoner. The other one, you know, Hughes suffered a lot, because he was shot down, not at the end of the war, like the second one I met him, but in 1943. It was his first and last flight of the war, because he was shot down. You know, the jet fighter shot him down, and you know, I don't know how many he was saved, but he suffered a lot. The other one, out of 7, 3 were saved. The others didn't get out of plane time, because I'm sorry, yes, sorry. You know, they trusted me, sort of, you know, when you talk to people, it's either they open up or not. Yeah, it's one of those. It's either they open up, and these people, they opened up, you know, and they realized I was interested very much in what I had to say. And I wrote everything down. I had to tape recorder until the tape recorder went bust. So I had to write everything in shorthand. I didn't know shorthand, so I was jotting down things, you know. Then came back home and fill in the blanks and check this and check that and check if the war last dated. And my war books, I have many here. You know, I checked there if the events, you know, there's the photo of the ships, you know, and these stories were true. Some suffered a lot. You know, the holy orders, they were attacked by, not attacked. Well,
Targeted? Were
Europe.
they targeted? You mean they were kind of targeted?
Yes, in occupied Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, whenever Allied planes used to see a train, they used to try to shoot, you know, to attack it. Some Father Joseph was on one of these trains, and so was Brother Edward, one of these trains. And you know, it stopped. The Germans let everybody out. So you know, these people were at being attacked by the US from there, and you know, they're trying to struggle, trying to struggle to save their life from the enemy and on the land. So they were, you know, from the land. You see,
I just can't imagine, you know, being in that position. And the way you've written it is, it really makes us appreciate the, you know, the experiences people went through, you know, war, and, you know, how we're living today, you know, fairly in a peaceful world without this, you know, constant threat of, you know, traveling and being hit by something. So I wanted to ask, when you did interview these people, was there anything, you know, out of these stories that you know, I know they were all new to you, but something that really stood out that you said, wow, I never knew that. Like, reading your stories, I had no idea that there were Maltese people as far as, you know, the Indian Ocean, or being held in a POW camp in Imperial Japan. I never even could imagine. I always just thought Europe, you know, Maltese people and British or Europe. So what was something that really stood out to you during these interviews from, you know, maybe 1 or 2 particular people that you thought, wow, I never knew that, Maltese people experienced this or participated in the war in a certain capacity. Which one really stood out to you?
Well, I've have a few excerpts from here, because I'd like to just maybe read a paragraph.
Of course, that would be lovely. I'd really enjoy that.
I have a story here. I have a prayer of a Lieutenant Colonel von Brogdorf. During the attacks, he was during the air attack on Malta. He was in Valletta. He was born there, and he said, "Dear lady, my mother, my queen, please guard and protect me as your own property and possession, and don't let me show that I am frightened in front of my men." This chap was attacked by a German fighter, and they got him on the BBC, and here he is. He commented on a recent BBC coverage of an extraordinary attack on him by one of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's fighters. This is a Messerschmitt 109, a very good fighter, one of the best German fighters. The extraordinary attack on him. In early 1940, he was entrusted to carry an important message from a senior officer to the station at San Paulo Tarja, codenamed Pretoria. So he went by way of the coast road on a motorcycle. On arriving at a point between the former old bridge, now the site of the Coastline Hotel, and the Alice Tower at Salina Bay, Edward caught sight of an enemy fighter in the distance. He thought nothing of it until the ground was suddenly whipped up, dispersing grit, gravel, and stones around him. As the barrel turned round, he realized that he had just been the target of a low-flying yellow-nosed German Messerschmitt PF-109 fighter, just a few feet above the ground. This is at 0 feet, below 50 feet. Since the road was only 3 yards wide and straddled by barbed wire and with traps, there was no space where he could maneuver the motorbike, so he made a beeline for the shelter of a nearby boulder. The Nazi fighter came round for a second pass, opening up again with his machine guns. In fact, the bullets were too close for comfort, whistling past his ears and ricocheting all around. So Edward resolved to make a dash for it on a nearby defensive beach post. Undaunted, the determined enemy peeled off over St. Paul's Bay and came round for a third pass, closing in on his quarry in no time at all. The enemy pilot was hell-bent on cutting down the enemy officer. Edward held his breath in time, as time seemed to be running out for him. He pondered whether it was the air. However, this time the German pilot, instead of opening fire, waved from the open cockpit to Edward's utter surprise. As Edward pulled himself together and very cautiously peered over the side, the German fighter split out over the sea. He was saved. Just wait for him and bye-bye.
Wow. I mean, this is what I want the audience to experience, exactly what you just read. It's just amazing.
This is true. And he didn't, when he felt sick. I can't tell you anymore. He felt sick.
Oh, wow.
There's an expression in English. He was a SA.
Say it in Maltese.
عمل تحته.
There you go.
He was in English, shit-arsed. He thought that's what he thought. Alfred, I was shit-arsed.
Yeah.
He couldn't hear the plane because the motorcycle makes a lot of noise. And, it's one of those things. It's one of those.
Of course. I mean, that just proves the fear that these people were experiencing. And you captured that for us to realize, the true, suffering and fear that people experienced at that time. I mean, we talk about it a lot, but I don't know if we really, have this perspective that you're bringing to us, in these stories. And it's
there is another one. There's another one. I won't I'll put Katie. There's Katie. Okay. I won't tell you. Here it is. This is a pilot who was shot down, you know. They were over Germany, bombing Nuremberg. This is the plane, 4-engine Avro Lancaster. It's a very, you know, very popular, was a very popular bomber in the Second World War. The snag was that it didn't have a defensive ventral at the bottom. You know, didn't have a gun at the bottom. You know.
So for people who are kind of lay terms, what does that exactly mean? So there was no guns on this plane?
No guns on the bottom, at the ventral.
Okay, got it. Okay.
So the German planes used to come from underneath. They had a vertical firing 30mm cannon. But that's it, you know. You know, they just opened up the belly and Katie confesses, we never knew what hit us, but thought that ground anti-aircraft was the cause. The bomber, still fully loaded with bombs, suddenly burst into flames, which were fed by the rupture of the tanks holding over 1,000 gallons of highly inflammable aviation fuel in the wings and dispersing itself to the fuselage. As the Lancaster was disintegrating fast, the pilot immediately gave the order for the crew to bail out. They scrambled for the escape hatch as their life depended on what would happen the next few seconds. However, the bomber was having some difficulty releasing the escape hatch, so the atmosphere among the crew became very tense. Finally, the hatch gave way, and he was out. Katie was next in line to be followed by the navigator, and the navigator never went out. Only three stayed. 4 others remained in the plane to explode because the pilot is the last one to leave the plane.
Right, so, just like the captain on a ship.
Stay there. He's the one, you know, inside the ship. The captain is the last one to die.
Right.
And then it's one of these things which make.
I mean, I just felt like my hands trembling, like if I was in there trying to get out and everybody's, you know, scrambling.
What happened was when it was a new plane, things are a bit sticky. The hatch is stiff. When it is a used plane, so
right, everything's ease, yeah, you know, yeah.
And there are about 2 or 3 hatches in the bomber, one the front, the mid, and the rear. Now, if the bomber is, you know, a flame, you know, at the back, so they have to either, you know, they have an X, cut the fabric, you know, try to, if there's no hatch, you know, they jump out because.
You see? That's amazing. So I want to go back to you and your family history and how this, yes, you know, how this all evolved and your interest in the Navy and Air Force in World War II. And reading your bio, your father, and it looks like your grandfather, and
yes,
I believe are some uncles or.
Yes, uncles in the Navy.
Right. Uncles, so there's a long line of naval, yeah, connection there. Could you want to explain how that all started, maybe back from your grandfather's days and yes, how it evolved till today?
Grandfather joined the Navy in 1900, and you know, and he, you know, he joined he joined the Navy in 1900. So he was in the First World War, and his line of action was in the Mediterranean, North Sea, you know, not very far. He spent 33 years in the Navy, but he wasn't, you know, it's on the Mediterranean, North Sea, but dead in the Second World War. He crossed to the Atlantic to Halifax and Nova Scotia, you know, with HMS Devonshire, you know. And many, his pals, his colleagues, were in the in battle against Japan, you know. This is the ship that, you know, sunk the Battle of Java, HMS Exeter. The ship got a beating from the Graf Spee. You know, the Graf Spee was very good, you know, very powerful battleship, you know. And these were cruisers, and they sort of attacked it because it was a a commerce raider. It was sinking British ships, you know, and they sank it. But this ship, the Exeter, was one of those which was damaged. So they repaired it and sent it to the, you know, to against Japan, Battle of the Java Sea. It's one of these things. I have the story in the paper today, newspaper, Sunday Times. One of these days for Charlie Paris, I interviewed him 6 times, and
Wow.
every time I interviewed, he used to tell me something different. So I had to talk them down. Today I covered all the, you know, I covered all the points. Just
And
jot them down.
what was this person's name that that you had interviewed several times?
Charles Paris. He died in 2012. He used to make clogs for the prisoners of war, because he was a prisoner of war with the Maltese, English, Australians, New Zealanders, Americans, and Dutch, because of the Dutch East Indies. Because the Japanese invaded the Dutch East Indies, American islands, English islands, and it was, the Japanese were very powerful. Their science was tops, and the Allies didn't realize. They used to call them yellows. The Japanese are very, very intelligent people. Science number one. You see their cars, But I got some. There was a prisoner of war, English prisoner of war, told me, Alfred, I was a prisoner of war. I suffered a lot. And then one day my son came and told me, I bought a Japanese car. I told him, get it out of my sight. I don't know, it's a nice car, see it? Alfred said, when I saw it, I put up.
Wow. So this British personnel that who experienced this in Imperial Japan, and there were other Maltese there that were POWs. About how many that you were able to document that were POWs in Imperial Japan? And this was in, I believe you said, what were the islands?
Celebes Islands.
Right.
You have to find it.
Yeah.
Because many of the places have been changed now.
Right, the names changed. So these 6 POWs that were in Imperial Japan, who were Maltese, seven of them, right? And there were other people who were part of the fleet with them that were British.
Yes,
also there.
British and the Americans, because there were the United States ship Pope. This was an old war for Pope. There was the HMS Encounter, and the Maltese joined it from England because he was married to an English girl. So he joined HMS Encounter. That was a destroyer, a small ship. But the cruiser was a larger ship, and these 6 people were all on the HMS Exeter, which sank.
So did they? When you found out about this story of people all the way in Japan experiencing, the terrible conditions of being a POW, what did you notice, like, that their experience was compared to others that were at the camp? Were they treated any differently than other nationalities, or were they all treated pretty much the same? And I read something where, some of the Maltese people were very clever in the way of they were surviving there. Which one, really, out of these POWs that were there, which survival story really hit you the most and that you documented?
The Maltese, when the Maltese joined the Navy, they were either cooks or stewards. See, that was their line of trade. So they used to cook, they used to serve, like my dad used to serve, officers. Then they used to go up, but the highest point that there was chief petty officer. That was the highest rank which every Maltese who was Maltese, not British, could achieve. And they survived.
I just wanted to interrupt you there. So a Maltese person, even though they were a British citizen, right? Under the British, government, they couldn't achieve any higher ranks?
No, because they were Maltese.
Really?
They wanted, yes, but after the war,
After World War II?
yes, then okay, Maltese became even officers, senior officers, like the son of Xavier Baldacchino.
Right.
He was
So
he was
even
a
if you had the skill
yes, no,
to be higher, you were not allowed until
no,
after World War II.
yes. I
Really?
mean, but if you joined after World War II, that
Right.
means you went to
You could get a
went to
higher
the,
rank.
yes, you went to the there's a college, Cranwell is for the Air Force personnel.
Mhm.
Sandhurst and Monza for the Army. For the Navy, I forgot the name.
It's okay, but we have a good understanding of
but
the timeline
they
of how
yes,
Maltese
I
were
don't
able
know.
to evolve into, higher ranks within the British Navy. And I just wanted to point that out. I just find that, very important for people to know why, Maltese people had just that level of
Yes.
rank in the Navy, even though they may have been more qualified to have a higher rank. And it wasn't until after World War II that they were able to have a higher rank
Yes.
based on training. So I just wanted
Yes.
to point that out, Alfred. I'm sorry if I
Yes,
interrupted you there.
No,
I just
no,
thought it was
it's
something very important for people to know.
It's all right. After World War II, they were attending Naval College. I forgot the name. Maltese were attending Naval College in Britain, so they could become officers, cadets, you see. Then they become, even with the RAF. There was a Maltese. There was a Maltese who was a flight lieutenant in the Royal Air Force, and he used to fly the Lightning, which had a speed of Mach 2, means 1,500 miles an hour. You see, that we used to have Lightnings, I remember. But when the war, there was the war, with the petrol war, the Middle East. So petrol was in short supply, and this fighter, when it went up like a rocket. It used to take up a lot of petrol, so they couldn't send two. At first, they used to send two sorts. But, the Russians used to send, a bear sort of. Bear means a four-engined bomber, to spy, to spy on the west. And these, especially on the north, Lucas in Scotland, there is the Royal Air Force to send two lightnings, to intercept this bomb. Used to buzz it, so.
Right. Like little mosquitoes in the air going after each other.
Yeah.
So I wanted to move on to the books again, and I noticed in the books, and I know you wrote, they were first featured in the Times of Malta on Sundays, right? And they were articles, and you have all these photos. How did you acquire the photos?
Yes.
Because I was also part of your research, and just to explain a little about that, I think it's, important to know how that was compiled.
I asked for the photos. I interviewed the person, and then asked him to lend me the photos. At that time, I didn't know that we could do what you call it. With the photo, you send it
like
by
scan it and email it.
There was no
Right.
In the late 90s and the beginning of, I don't know if there were scanned. So I used to borrow the photos and then keep them until the article is printed, and then I used to give them back. You say give them back. I don't like to keep photos which aren't mine. Because if you keep a thing which is not yours, that means it won't be trusted anymore.
Right.
See,
you needed to keep your image going for more.
Yes. and then I tell them, look, I'm going to come with the photo. No, Harry, no, Harry. No, I want to give them to you. Because I have many of them. I don't want to lose. And after, after the article, so I returned the photos. Photos are very, very helpful because, I mean, the Times told me that we can't have an article without any photos. So
Wow.
about 5 and 6 photos.
And about how long did it take you to, I know it's very hard because depending on the person you were profiling, how long did it take you to, like for one story, like on average, like when you found somebody you were going to embark on profiling, how long did it take, from beginning to end to compile a story, just on average?
3-4 months.
Oh, wow.
So about 4, because it depends on the length.
Right,
Some
exactly.
people have a lot of things to say, and some people, it's short.
Right.
Some people, but usually, about an average one takes about 4 A4s or 5.
Wow.
My dad's wasn't, I had the family history, so it was
right. You had more extensive information on that.
Yes, there's my story too, and I have my photos, and I keep them here and here. But they are, very, very sort of treasured possessions.
Right.
And I give I examine the text and see if I can find better words, because sometimes I want a word I can't find it, so I recommend. But I'm not. I studied Italian and Maltese and deeply, but not English.
Well, you did a very good job because when I was reading them, I really felt immersed into these people's experiences quite well. And I really am enjoying them. I'm going to start opening up, the Q&A. So I'm just going to let my audience, whoever would like to ask Alfred any questions, that we're going to be open, and you could shoot or raise your hand or send a chat, and I'll unmute you so you can speak to Alfred and ask him any questions you may have.
Okay.
Perfect. There you go. Take a deep breath. It's just the internet. It's okay. Just be glad you're not teaching these days. Everyone's got to teach virtually now. Could you imagine doing that?
As I was saying, this Jesuit father, Father Joseph, he went down and he didn't have any food because they took 5 days from the south to the north to take fight, and they didn't have any food. There was some Italian soldiers, and they looked at the father and they gave him some food.
Wow.
And he went to a nearby convent where the train stopped, and not convent, a church. Knocked on the door. He said, "Father, can you give me some food?" And this father gave him a tin of paste.
Wow.
He said, "Oh, I'm going to open this tin of paste now." It's one of those things,
Right.
But then he went to Britain in 1944. The war was still on. However, the Germans had started sending the V1 bombs. They couldn't be reached except by the fastest planes. So they're flying them from occupied France into London. Bombay, Surrey, southeast. And many people are being killed. This flying bomb came, and the Royal Air Force, I was reading today, had developed the first jet fighter, which was the Meteor, and it was 500 miles an hour plane, no screws, just jet. They used to reach this flying bomb and shoot it down with 30mm cannon, because 30mm has a range of about 250 yards. So you could shoot it from far. If you shoot it from a small distance, it explodes in your face, and can damage the plane. Plane might fall. And some people came and living near the father. And it was at Haythrop College in England, and some people didn't have any food, and he didn't have any food. However, he went to the authorities, told them, "Look, I was a prisoner of war in Italy. I've endured 4 years of prisoners in Italy studying. Now I don't have any food, and they gave him a lot of food, and he gave nearly all the food because they gave him too much to his neighbors, English neighbors. It's an act of charity. It's one of
Right,
those things,
right. Yeah, I mean, it was something that people were experiencing during war. You know, there was a lot of hunger and, you know, like you said, charity. And, you know, I still can't imagine having that, you know, like being without or just having one portion a day or,
Yes.
and like the POWs working and having measly portions and expected to do this hard labor,
Yes.
or even being on
Especially,
the ships, you know.
especially with the Japanese, they used to
Oh, we
slave
have a
labor.
question. Sorry,
Yes,
Alfred.
please, yes, Mr. Fennec, I can see your.
Yes, there you are, Lou. Hi, how are you? Go ahead.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, well, it's fascinating, the stories you were sharing with us. Thank you. My parents are both, of course, from Malta. My dad is from Mosta.
I
mom
live
is
in
from-
Mosta.
I beg your pardon?
I live in Mosta.
Oh, you
We
do?
live
Oh,
in
cool.
Mosta.
Well, then you can answer some of my questions. And my mom is from Birzebuja.
Birzabuja.
Right.
Nice to see you.
And they met in Toronto, which is very bizarre.
Oh, nice.
But, you know, I grew up on these stories of the Second World War. My dad was born in 1938, and he was, of course, quite young. And his family was one of the bakers' families in Mosta at the time. And so they were really hard pressed because bread was at such a premium.
Yes.
And my grandfather, after whom I'm named, was very keen on ensuring that the bread was distributed equitably.
Yes.
That is my predominant memory of my father's childhood. And my mother, of course, my mother was born on D-Day. So since we were this big, that's all she could talk about, right? About being born on D-Day. But anyway, this Maltese fascination with the Second World War intrigues me because as well, when my mom used to address letters to her sisters back in Birzebuja, she would write Malta, GC.
Yes.
Right?
George Cross.
George. And is that still a common thing? Excuse my ignorance.
It was after the war, but you can write it down. But you have to say Malta, George Cross, because if you don't write, my dad received. He had to receive a letter. It went to the GC Gold Coast. Gold Coast. It's another place in Africa, I think.
Yeah, I know.
Gold Coast. So he thought Malta. They wrote GC, the Malta, and then GC. But they emphasized on the GC, which meant for them, some people, Gold Coast, which is another place. I don't know where it is.
Right.
So you have to write Malta. You can say Malta. The British like to say to Malta because it was an honor for the Maltese people to receive the George Cross after King George VI.
And the second thing I want to ask about is, you know, I remember when we were kids in the 70s, we would shuttle back and forth between Malta and Canada, Birzebuja and Mosta, and so on. And my dad would take us to the cathedral to see this bomb. I think it was a bomb, an unexploded munition.
Yes.
Tell me something about that, because I found that to be the weirdest thing in the entire world when I was a kid, walking into this church and there is this, I mean, literally this munition. Anyway, please, I'm all ears.
It is. It's usually is a bomber which throws a bomb. A fighter doesn't carry bombs. However, some of the fighters used to carry bombs, and if they were instructed to bomb something, sometimes they were harassed by the British fighters, so they threw the bombs and hurried away, before being shot down. And this, yes, the bomb of, there is a replica of the bomb which fell on the Mosta church. I remember it was, there was, I don't remember the whole, but they made it, they repaired it. And after some rain went in, and it's, you know, it wasn't a good patch up. It was they had to do it again. But if you go and see it, you won't find the sign where the bomb fell. It seems that people were there in the church, and this bomb fell. It rolled near the altar, but it didn't explode. They came rushing out. Some people were hurt by the debris, you know, the falling stones, but nobody was hurt. Nobody was, you know, hurt severely. However, there is a shelter in Mosta. It's off near Eucharistic. There is a shelter near the church, yes, for the people to shelter themselves from the church, from the Dirba. But there was a shelter on going out of Mosta, Eucharistic Congress, the one on the right. There's there was a shelter there. It's on a side street, and a bomb just fell on the shelter, and it killed 29 people there. They were buried, you know, killed 29. And there is a placard. If you come to Mosta, we can meet. I will show it to you.
Yeah. When this pandemic is over, it's
Yes,
one of the first places I'm going to visit.
But
we're all ready for that visit.
Yeah,
we're all desperate here for that visit to Malta, Alfred. Very desperate.
Oh, we're all desperate until this.
Yes.
No passes, because everybody's inside, you know.
Right. So I wanted to kind of you know, have some closing remarks about your books here, and I have them as well. Volume 1 and Volume 2 here, and they're fascinating, and they're laid out in a way that when you read them, it clearly defines. Here's a little.
Yes, he was on a Polish submarine.
Yes.
There's the king. Yes, there's the.
Paul Camilleri. Which I would never have known, you know, Maltese on a Polish submarine. I mean,
yeah, it was a British submarine, but they gave it to the Poland.
Right.
And they got the Polish stuff, and the captain wanted some foreigner, and Paul Camilleri, he went in. Well, he joined. He was interested. He joined, you know, and the ship sank a few small ships, you know. And
right.
Then it was attacked by Italian warships, nearly sank. And
there was a lot of action going on with your stories. I see there was so much action going on.
Yes, there's this. I read it for you. Just a few things.
Yes, of course.
Here, in December 42, the Sokol, this was the name of the Polish Sokol from HMS Urchin, was deployed for patrol of Bear Island to provide support for the safe passage of Russian convoys to the coastline. During a taped interview, Paul described one typical Arctic action during a moonlit night. The klaxon sounded, meaning action stations. Klaxon means the horn. And every man ran to his post. The Sokol, which had been charging its batteries on the surface, dived at once. They used to charge the batteries at night. And then in the morning dive, you know, to find some enemy ship and torpedo. And dived at once. Captain Carnegie, that's the Polish, put up periscope and identified an enemy ship. 4 torpedoes were fired, hitting the target. There was no time to check whether the ship had sunk or not, as the captain saw an empty sub vessel closing fast on its quarry. It means submarine. and the sub had to make a quick getaway. Depth charges were fired at the approximate position of the submarine. The crew on board the so-called did not utter a word or make a sound, which would have otherwise betrayed their work. There was nothing they could do except wait for the explosion of the depth charges. One muffled sound followed by another and still another. However, the receding noise of the enemy boat's propellers meant that the danger had passed. Yes, but there is another one here, which said here, the enemy ship sank, but a hornet's nest had been stirred, escorting enemy motor torpedo boats. They probably was veritarian. Sped towards the sub, which dived deeper and deeper. Depth charges were fired. A muffled explosion was heard in the distance. Another and still another. There seemed to be no end to these. There was nothing to do except to wait and pray to the Almighty. One explosion put out the light, which was repaired in no time at all. The next one rattled the pipes, and with the other, water started pouring in. The crew immediately plugged the holes. They could hear the burning propellers of the enemy MTBs motored over their heads. Paul counted 4 to 5 explosions. He later said it was if hell were let loose on that day, but they lived to tell the tale.
That is, I just can't imagine being.
I interviewed him when he was, he was going.
Yeah. I think what you've done is amazing, really, recording their stories. And, Malta itself was an unsung hero in the war itself. And then having these people who were, spread out, and you giving them a voice and recording them and, giving them, the platform that's due to them, for their experiences in the war. Which I find wonderful and commending that you've embarked on this. And and I just want to tell everybody, thank you for joining us. I don't know if anyone has any more questions. These books are available at Wise Owl Books. And, they have a site on Facebook. And if anyone has a problem ordering the books, they could just reach out to us through our website, and we'll direct you to the correct way of ordering these books. And Alfred, will you continue to write in other, continue with these stories? And they are going to be collected through family members now, since a lot of these people are coming of age or have passed, correct?
I gave the books. I asked the publisher, who was so kind to help me. I had a mistake in one ship. It was one ship, not the other. Alfred, the ship is this one, not the photo, I think. He helped me a lot. And well, if I do write, I write in the paper, but it's repeating stories, because I wrote this from 2003. I wrote this Paris. I wrote it in 2008, so it was 12 years ago. But since Charles Paris was giving me, I was realizing that I was getting something new, so I repeated the story, but I wrote the new thing,
Right.
One which is today.
It's something like it's a work in progress. People remember things. Things are found, so it's constantly in development as you unearth things. Yeah.
And the British Navy discovered the sinking of this ship, where the whereabouts.
Right.
And they 2 frogmen went down, and one tied in today's ship, which I haven't had the base back. He tied a British, the white ensign to the torpedo tube of the HMS Exeter, which sank there. He found it. It is in memory, because when a ship sinks, or an aeroplane is slowed down, you cannot go and pick up things and take them for yourself, because they belong to they are the cemetery of the people who died on the ship. They're the cemetery of and there in the aviation museum, there's the story of this hurricane. It is in this, it's still in the aviation museum. there is was a flight sergeant, Hexton. He took off from Luqa and over the cliffs of Zurich. You know, the airplane started burning. Maybe he was attacked, and it fell in the sea. A flame on fire, and he just drowned. And when the aviation knew about it, they wanted to restore, to get the plane, and they wrote to the family, could we, put up the plane from the sea, recuperate it? And they told yes, they had very. So the letter was sent to the aviation museum, framed, permit. You can get the plane. They got the plane as soon with the it's a jib with a on a tugboat, and it's very tough. They took as soon as the plane, the engine of the plane surfaced, began to fall apart. So they recuperated the plane. They changed everything. They got the spare parts, and now they are building the plane. This Hawker Hurricanes. It's in the aviation museum. It's
you worked there at the aviation museum.
Voluntary.
You volunteered, right? So
at the moment, I'm on quarantine. Not on quarantine.
Right. But there's no doubt of your knowledge here about the naval history and some of this aviation history. There's absolutely no doubt about it. So I really do encourage everybody to, if they can, to read your books. Because of the accuracy and meeting you and you portraying your knowledge in this is really, really impressive. I am very impressed by you and your books. So we're going to wrap up this interview, and I wanted to thank everyone. Did you have your Sunday Times? Were you able to get a copy of your, there we go, yes. Look at that. Today's
Paris leading seaman, prisoner of war of Imperial Japan.
Congratulations.
This the HMS Sussex, 3-funneled. It's a cruiser.
Right.
My father liked it. It was the most popular ship of the Maltese seamen because everybody joined on it.
Wow. I'm sure my dad had some photos of those because he didn't collect pictures of cars. He collected pictures of tankers and ships.
This is the HMS.
Could you lift it up a little higher? Yeah, there you go. Great.
This is HMS Exeter in 1927-28. The ships which the British had were all old.
Right. Recycled. Everything was recycled. Yeah.
The Germans had new ships. Huh?
That's wonderful.
This is
Charles Harris. Yeah.
The sinking ship, you see, and it was ambushed. It was ambushed by the Japanese. The Japanese were very, very, very good.
Aggressive, yeah.
They had the largest battleship, 18-inch guns. A bomb like that, an 18-inch, quite a 18-inch.
Yeah.
And the Americans, it was called Admiral Yamato. And the Americans sank it.
Wow. But that's great. So this was a great day to have an interview with you in conjunction with your article, being published in the Times of Malta on Sunday. So it was a great culmination here.
Yeah. If I do another story, I'll tell you. But I think I don't know if it will be this year because that I wrote that story in July. So July, August, September, no, 7 months. So
wow.
But I don't know.
Well, there were challenges too with the whole pandemic situation. So again, thank you so much. Thank you everybody for joining. And again, his books are available at Wise Owl Bookshop, and you can all reach out to me if you need more information about the books. And we'll be doing our next Il-MALTIN TAGNA in another 2 weeks. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and my followers I see out there. Thank you.
Thank you for your interest, everybody.
Of course.
Thank you.
If you need anything to, any questions, just tell me.
Yes, wonderful.